This week on Q&A, a look at the American and British forms of government. From our recent interviews in London, this program compares and contrasts the parliamentary form of government with our own.
Is there any way to describe the differences between the way Americans govern and the way the Brits govern?
I think there's a lot of different things, and it's also to do with the political culture. I'm always struck, and it may sound strange, it may sound like a bit sort of treacherous to my media colleagues over here. I think the quality of intellectual discussion in the media is, funnily enough, higher in the US. I think the discussion of political issues is somewhat more dominated by policy rather than sort of the minutiae of Washington life. Here, you tend to get weeks that are bound up with tiny Westminster stories that nobody in the rest of the UK, I think, was interested in. But in terms of the politicians in the UK do talk about the issues probably more than the politicians in the US. So I was sort of struck by that the politicians are sort of caught in a rather superficial level of discourse because they're worried about their money raising and everything else. That doesn't happen so much here in the UK.
In January, we'll have a Republican House of Representatives and a Democratic Senate and a Democrat in the White House. Here, explain the difference. David Cameron is the Prime Minister, and he has proposed all these cuts. Will you automatically get these cuts? And in the United States, you're not sure until the Congress passes.
Pretty automatically. I think a mistake a lot of British people who follow British politics make is to think that they're broadly comparable, the British and the American system, and that your president is like our Prime Minister, and that you have two houses of your parliament and we have two of ours. Well, no. Our Prime Minister has much more power than your President. He has complete power over the lower house, the House of Commons, and the upper house, the House of Lords, has very limited powers. It has no powers over anything that costs money or raises money at all. It has no powers in the Revenue Department. And even its powers in the rest of legislation are only the power to delay. It can keep sending bills back that it doesn't like until a year has passed, and then the Parliament Act can be invoked and the thing goes through anyway. Our House of Lords is not democratically elected, it's appointed. There are plans to reform that. Whether they're going to come about or not, nobody knows. But it has no real democratic legitimacy. It has expertise. So it has not been set up to be, so to speak, in opposition to the House of Commons. It often looks to us British, looking across at your system, as though you have set up two arms of government almost to oppose each other and to slow the possibilities of making any big change fast.
Well, if our president selects the Treasury Secretary, he has to go, or she goes before Congress and has to be approved. Here, who decided that George Osborne is going to be the Chancellor of the Exchequer?
The Prime Minister. The
Prime Minister. Himself?
Entirely his own decision. Entirely.
How much appointment power does the Prime Minister have? How many different jobs does he fill, or she?
He fills virtually the whole of the government.
But how many would that be?
About 100 appointments.
And do all of those come from members of the House of Commons or members of the House of Lords?
Yes.
They have to?
Yes. And if they are not, if he particularly wants them in, he puts them into the House of Lords, which he can do quickly. So,
what's the restraint on the number of people you can put in the House of Lords right now?
There is no real restraint. You would be very much criticised if you put too many in, as Mr. Brown and Mr. Blair are criticised today. But there is no legal constraint. If they can have the nerve to do it, they can do it.
And how long is your appointment as a Lord?
For life. For life. There's no the two categories of people in the House of Lords that in my time have been on a limited tenure have been the church leaders, the bishops. They have to give up when they cease to be bishops, and the judges, because our Supreme Court was part of the House of Lords up till about 2 years ago, and they've now moved out and they no longer sit as members of the House of Lords. So
how's the Supreme Court justice here appointed?
Well, we have an independent appointments board of which the Lord Chancellor, who's a member of the government, has quite a bit of influence over, and they are appointed by an advisory committee of people, of which the senior judges have a pretty good say, I think.
Is there any way that the public can get rid of a judge by impeaching like they do in the United States?
I've never heard it. I've never heard of it. I mean, I'm technically, I can't tell you. I'm sure there must be a way, but it's never happened in my lifetime. But I think the Lord Chancellor or the head of the judiciary, the senior judge in the Supreme Court, would just who schedules the appearances would make sure he didn't get any work to do.
What about the cabinet positions for the Prime Minister? What if people don't like a cabinet officer? Is there any way to get rid of them?
Only if the Prime Minister wants to get rid of them. The Prime Minister has the total say, and the only way you really can get rid of them is by having a vote of no confidence in the Prime Minister, because if the Prime Minister backs them, you can't get rid of them. But the Prime Minister, of course, is quite sensitive to his own political position, and he wouldn't support somebody who was clearly had lost favour with everybody.
Based on what you know, would you, and if you had even the opportunity, would you rather be Prime Minister, forget the country involved, but Prime Minister of Great Britain or President of the United States when it comes to the power and the ability to get things done?
I think the Prime Minister of this country has a great deal of power, more power than people realise, and whilst the President does have a great deal of power, the Prime Minister in this country, skillfully operating, has a great deal of power and can get most things done, some of which the President of the United States would find very difficult.
You have a coalition government here for the first time since when?
Though there was a coalition government in the 1930s of a kind, and of course during the Second World War we had a coalition government, and during the 1970s we had an informal working arrangement between the Liberal Party and the Labour Party. But almost all those previous coalitions have been weak-kneed things where a government that was in trouble was needing to be propped up by another party, or to get us through an emergency like the Second World War. What I think nobody alive in Britain today has any real experience of is a willing coalition between two quite strong parties who, when joined together, when their forces are joined, are in a fairly impregnable position, and who more or less agree with each other on the main areas of policy. This is a sort of healthy coalition that has within itself the seeds not only of being able to carry on for 5 years, but perhaps to carry on the other side of a general election. And that's new to us in Britain. It's very common on the continent, but not here.
So I'm a member of the Conservative Party. I stand for what? Can you delineate between the Conservatives, or if I'm a Liberal, I stand for what? Liberal Democrat, or if I'm a Labour Party member?
If you were to draw a continuous spectrum from what you might call the left to the right, the Conservative Party tends to occupy the right-hand third of that spectrum, although there are wild extremists over to the right who are not in the Conservative Party. The Labour Party tends to occupy the left-hand third. But to say that the Liberal Party is in the middle third would be wrong, because there are a great many Liberal MPs who are to the right of some Conservative MPs, and there are some Liberal MPs to the left of some Labour MPs. The Liberal Party, you see, is liberal in the old sense of the word, not the way you use the word in America. You tend to mean left-wing by liberal in the United States. We don't. Liberal means a belief in individual freedom, a belief in individual liberty.
Would that be like a libertarian?
Now, you could be there are plenty of libertarians in the Liberal Party. There are high-tax liberals, but there are low-tax liberals as well. It's the belief in freedom, the belief in individual liberty that distinguishes the party.
Let me test it this way. Let's say that you have the Iraq War or the Afghan War. If you're a conservative, what's your position?
If you're a conservative, your position ranges from being against the war all along, as both of them, as I was, to being really enthusiastically in favour of them, to, and this would be the characterisation I think of most conservatives, to the feeling that these were rather difficult foreign policy adventures, military adventures, where we had a duty to support the United States, even if we had some doubts about the adventure. Liberals are almost all against, the Liberal Democrat Party are almost all against both wars.
This was the first election that we had leaders. The leaders, like you do in America, presidential candidates, we had our prime ministerial candidates, although the public hadn't got any right to vote for them, they had only time to write, but they had 3 debates. And I think they were generally thought to be a success, and I think they will be a regular feature of future elections. But there was a great deal of difficulty about it because Mrs. Thatcher would never have taken part in them, partly because she didn't hold with that sort of thing, so to speak, but also she would have been told by her advisors that you've got everything to lose and nothing to gain. You're in the lead, but this election was quite interesting, really. David Cameron was very keen to have them because he was pretty certain he could out-debate Gordon Brown in the elections. You know, others judge whether it's right or wrong, but that's what he felt. And he completely, in my view, underestimated the appeal of Nick Clegg of the Liberals, who was able to say in several answers to the question, well, you two keep arguing about it, but the reality is something else, you see. And so the first time, the Liberal man was the outstanding winner of that debate, and the polls went up. By the second one, they'd got a better way of handling him, and they got it right. But it was quite interesting how it took place.
One of the things about this country, the system we have, is that once you win an election, you have a lot more power than in the American system, because what you don't have is this kind of balance of powers. You know, we have a very different system. We have an unwritten constitution, for one thing, and the way it works is kind of winner takes all, in that the party that wins the election provides the Prime Minister and provides the cabinet ministers.
What does it cost you to run?
Well, we have really tough campaign finance rules when you're running as a member of Parliament, as a congressman, as you would say it. And the amount of money you can spend is fixed, and it's calculated according to your population. And nobody else, no political action committee or your national party is not allowed to run ads in your campaign. You can't buy television time if you're a British parliamentary candidate, so that cuts out a lot of spending. As I say, people can't buy television time on your behalf. And I think the very first time I ran for Parliament, which is now 23 years ago, I remember my cash limit, if it was yesterday, and it was £4,500. I think in an American congressional election, I don't think you can go more than a few days on $4,500.
$4,500. It would have been close to close to $8,000.
Yeah.
But how do you raise that?
Oh, the party raises it. The party raises it through bake sales and inviting donations. I mean, the sorts of campaigns you run in this country are very much door to door, because you don't have television advertising, because you don't have a huge budget. It's about going door to door, it's about producing literature. Nowadays, of course, you can have like a campaign website, but we very much rely, partly because the districts are smaller than American districts, we very much rely on door to door. I mean, the National Party gets business donations, and that's a subject of much criticism. But if you're talking about local members of Parliament, as I say, we have tough campaign rules, and they serve us well, because I can't imagine, if I'd had to raise a lot of money, that a very radical young black woman could have got elected 23 years ago.
How much do they pay you for your job?
They pay me, I think it's about £65,000.
So that would be somewhere close to $110,000.
Yeah. Yeah.
$100,000 to $110,000.
Yeah.
Is that enough to live on here?
Sure.
Comfortably?
Well, it's certainly a lot more than most people in my district earn, so I'm fine with it.
What does a lord make every year in money?
He doesn't get a penny piece in salary, not a penny piece in salary, but he does get expenses which are not unreasonable. But I guess that a member of the House of Lords could turn in, including all his expenses and things, maybe $50,000 a year, that sort of figure.
In the United States, as you know, a member of the Senate or the member of the House, by and large, can't do any outside work. What is the rule here?
What is the rule here is that you can do outside work unless you are a member of the government, but if you're just a backbencher like I am, you can do outside work, and indeed the House of Lords is designed really to encourage you to do so, because we believe that the House of Lords should be filled with a large number of people who have expertise in all sorts of different areas of like surgeons, professors, lawyers, and people who are most of the time practicing their trade, so to speak, but turning up at the House of Lords to take part in the debates that do it. Some people, like me, have become politicians. I'm there every day, but then I don't have that sort of expertise that these people have.
Can a member of the House of Commons do outside work?
I think they can do some, but I think it is fairly limited now, and very much has to be, every penny of it has to be declared, and I think gradually they're not. And I think that's a pity too. I do think that we are better governed by people who have at least one foot in the real world, as long as we know where they are. I mean, I would not defend for a minute anybody advocating a particular cause in Parliament and not making it absolutely abundantly clear where they were coming from.
Do you have a disclosure requirement on where you make your money outside of the House of Lords?
Yes, you do, but you don't have to say how much you make. Maybe to show how little it is, but you don't have to, whatever it is. You have to say what you do, where your interests are, and that's all filed and recorded.
Is there any way to compare David Cameron, the Prime Minister, to any politician in the U.S.?
That's an interesting question. I don't think you would get a similar kind of character. I'm trying to think. I mean, he's very much, he's quite an establishment figure in terms of his background. He comes from a very, what we would say, posh background, and so do many of the people in his cabinet. So he's a sort of traditional Tory Prime Minister. I'm not sure who the comparison would be in the States. But he has become known, at least in the lead up to this, when he became a leader, he was the fresh face. He was supposed to be a compassionate conservative. I mean, in that sense, you could compare him to George Bush, but I'm not sure that he would embrace the comparison. Although, you know, in a sense, George Bush also was from a sort of more traditional US background. But I think that the key thing about David Cameron is that he has at least given the impression of wanting to change the Conservative Party, make it more modern, in a sense do to the Conservative Party what Tony Blair did to the Labour Party, make it recognise that things have changed, people are more tolerant than they were maybe 10 years ago in the UK, and also have a more open-minded approach to how do you run government. But on the things like the budget, they're pretty hard, traditional in the sense of wanting to cut spending pretty sharply. That's something we see here from Conservative governments that we haven't always seen from US Republican governments. They talk a lot about cutting taxes, but they haven't always cut spending very much. Usually they've increased it.
If you're looking at Great Britain from the United States and can't figure out what's really going on with all the cuts, and you refer to cutbacks here as just plain cuts, can you explain to us how severe the economic cutbacks are here?
They have not yet bitten, but they're going to bite, and people are increasingly able to see where they're going to bite. To explain how severe the cuts will need to be, one has to give an impression, first, of the bloatedness and profligacy of British government over the last 10 years or so. We have almost doubled our expenditure on our healthcare, on our National Health Service. Nobody doubts that the service has got better, but it hasn't got twice as good. We've gone up from about 4% of our gross domestic product to something like 8% of our GDP. I think you Americans are closer to the 10%, and that's with private healthcare, but we've virtually doubled it. Everywhere you go, schools, school building, welfare, claims for benefit, which is to say the way the state helps you when you're unemployed, have soared. Incapacity benefit, which is where you say that you're unable to work due to backache or whatever it may be. Well, it may be serious, but it may not. And the non-serious, the malingering claims, I think have grown. Things have increased expenditures have increased not by 5, 10, 15%, but by 40, 50, 60%, to the extent that the proportion of our wealth that is now being spent by the state has climbed from around the 40s to around the 50%. We can't carry on like this, and these things have got to be cut.
How does the percentage of debt here compare with U.S.?
Well, it's interesting. We're in the sort of in the same ballpark. And I guess the question is, I mean, America, with its unique position and having the reserve currency, at least for the moment, of the world, gets special treatment, I guess, so they can get away with more borrowing than we can. Our borrowing, the deficit, is similar to the US. This year it was 11% of national income, which is roughly what I think it's going to be in the States. And that was considered to be an outrage by the incoming Conservative government. It's much higher than when the International Monetary Fund, when the IMF famously had to come and bail the UK out in the late 70s. So people were very focused on that. But it's looking, with this new government making such strides against some opposition and some concern by economists, I should say, but with this government trying so hard to bring it down, I would say our borrowing is going on a downward path. Our debt is still probably in the sort of average level. It's risen a lot, but it's sort of in the middle of the pack in terms of developed countries. Whereas in the US, it still looks like it's going up as far as the eye can see. The stock of debt relative to the economy is going to be in the same ballpark. I suspect in the US case it's going to be a bit higher, but then it depends how you treat some of this state debt and how you treat there's very exciting debates we can not have about how you treat the Social Security Trust Fund, but those kind of things. But we're in the same ballpark. But what I guess is different is that the UK have now put forward what most people would say is a credible plan for putting the debt on the downward path. So not just you're borrowing less, but you're also not allowing the stock of debt to rise after the next few years. That's not what's happened in the US.
This is a small thing for you, probably not for the person I was talking to last night, who said that if you're over, I think, is it 65 or 70, you get free bus rides.
60.
Over 60.
That's the insanity. Gordon Brown had introduced, there were quite a few what we would call freebies here that were introduced by him that now cost a lot of money. It's free TV licenses for older people. That is actually, I think, over 70. You get a
over
free
75.
TV,
I read that
over
this morning.
75,
yeah.
and you get that's actually a free right to watch the BBC, because here if you buy a TV, you have to buy a TV license which costs a little under $200, maybe $175, and that goes free to people over 75, even if they're very well off. Now, it's even more extreme in the case of the bus travel. If you're over 60, absolutely everybody in Britain can get a card entitling them to free bus travel, sort of out of peak times in the UK, in London, but otherwise it's free bus travel. That is a point of contention. David Cameron was pressured on the campaign in the election to say he would keep it, but boy, the Treasury would like to get rid of it. They think it's crazy to be giving this free travel to a lot of rich pensioners and the rich elderly people.
What are people now coming to you in this advice session that is a direct result of the cuts?
They're very frightened. They're very frightened for their jobs. Because one of the things this new government is going to do is make very big cuts in jobs in the public sector. And some government departments are going to lose 20%, 30%. And most people in my district who work for the government in some form or fashion, hospitals, schools, government departments, and they're very frightened for their jobs. That's the big thing.
So what special payments are there in this country for either children or older people, old people?
Well, in this country, we have a system of benefit payments for unemployed people, and obviously we pay an old age pension to the elderly. And again, the other thing people are worried about, apart from their jobs, is the fact that George Osborne is going to cut a lot of these benefits, and people are worried about how they're going to manage and how much worse the situation is going to get.
So how much does an older person who's retired get in a pension? How is it determined?
Well, it's a standard. You get a standard amount of money. I think it's about £70 a week for a single person.
So you're talking about $110 a week.
But they also get other payments. They can also get other payments. They get a payment to help them with fuel in the winter. But the basic payment is about £70 a week. But what's happened is this new government hasn't altered the basic payment, but other payments they could get, whether they're payments for medical conditions or help with other things, they're being cut back, and people are very worried about it.
What are some of the complaints that you get in your office all the time from your constituents?
They are just worried about how they're going to manage without a job. People are very concerned that the government has tripled the tuition fees that people have to pay, and people are frightened of that. People are worried about the future. I mean, my district, we had an unprecedentedly high turnout, the highest turnout I've had for 20 years, and I doubled my majority with an increased electorate. And they came out because they wanted to support me and also support my party, because they knew that this government that's come in is not good for poor people.
We have roughly 2 million people that work for the federal government. When we watched the cuts being announced over here, it said 500,000 people are going to be cut in the public service. Is that like cutting a fourth of our civil service? Is it the same thing? Or how do you find 500,000 civil servants in a country that only has 60 million people?
Well, they aren't all civil servants. They're everybody. They're. I think there's going to be. It's maybe 100,000 civil servants, but it's also going to be. They're hoping it won't be too many, but it will be the policemen and whatever, and it'll be the bureaucrats who are dealing with the different departments. It's also going to be a lot of local authority, local government officials. Again, the other thing to remember is in that figure, it's all the people working for local government, and actually a good chunk of that is going to be from
excuse me to interrupt, but
government.
what control does the Prime Minister have over the local government?
Well, he's doing a classic trick of saying we are going to cut how much money we're going to give to the local government, but we're going to give you a lot more control over how to spend it. They hated the fact that that they were forced to spend on certain things. It's like a similar debate in the States. The States hate having the federal government control how they spend their money. Well, in a sense, Cameron said, look, you're going to have a lot less money, guys, but we're going to stop putting so much control over how you spend it. So in that sense, he's going to have less control over what the local government does than his predecessor. But a lot of the cuts are going to be felt at a local level, and in a sense, most voters are going to be blaming their local authorities for that. They're not going to be blaming Westminster.
But as you know, in the United States, if the president stood up and said we're going to cut the money to the states, he may never be able to do that because Congress might not go along with it. What about here? If the Chancellor of the Exchequer stands up in Parliament and says we're going to cut the money to the states, does that mean it's going to be cut?
That means it's going to be cut. That's what I was telling you about the key difference between here.
Just like that, though,
the
when
stuff
they
they say in Parliament happens is the key difference. And you get the times where the government doesn't get its way are pretty celebrated, and you would hear about them even in the States, because they would be a major loss for the government. Now, in a sense, things are a bit different in a coalition government, because you've got a lot of debate between the two parties, the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives, that has to happen behind closed doors within the Treasury before these things get announced. So in a sense, there's now a new check and balance on the Conservatives' power that wouldn't normally have been there. But once you get to the point of announcing it in Parliament, unless something cataclysmic happens, then it goes through. That's the parliamentary system. It's a very different system.
If you worked for, let's say, the Chancellor of the Exchequer here, George Osborne, versus the Treasury Secretary in the United States, what would the day be like? What would the attitude be like? What would the speech writing be like?
I suspect the speech writing process will be similar, because it depends on the person. I know there are some leaders who are very careful about their speeches, and they want everyone to have seen it beforehand, and they work on them weeks in advance. I suspect they're in the minority. I think most of these guys get in there, they have people they trust, they want to do it at the last minute. I would be doing, the people at the Treasury, the US Treasury, would be tearing their hair out, because Larry and I would be discussing his crucial speeches at 3 a.m, and there wasn't time for a lot of checking by the rest of the bureaucracy. But I suspect that is similar. What is really interesting and different is the UK Treasury is much more powerful in the UK than the US Treasury is. I was sort of amazed to I should have known this going in, but when I went into the US Treasury, what was surprising to me was how impotent it is. In a sense, it doesn't have control over the monetary policy in the US because that's the Fed's job. It doesn't really control budget policy because the president will produce any budget he wants to produce, and even if he's got control over the Congress, let alone if he doesn't, the budget that he produces in January is kindly received and then completely ignored. As you know, the situation here is completely different. The Treasury in a government, even a coalition government, is pretty much all powerful. The Chancellor, I have American friends who've been astonished to watch this when they come here. The Chancellor, the Finance Minister, stands up on a certain day. You saw the report I did on the day in the spring when this happened. They stand up on a certain day in Parliament, they announce what they're going to do, they sit down, and in a week or so, it will have happened. There is none of the debate, none of the months of painful back and forth that you have in Congress. I think that's the key difference. The Treasury is just much more powerful. Of course, when you come to the rest of the world, no one really cares anymore what the UK Treasury thinks. But in the case of the US, we did have an awful lot of control. Some people said too much control over the policies that the IMF and others were imposing on other countries. So the irony was we had a lot more control over many other countries' policies than we did over our own.
I'm sure you've watched what's happened in the United States over the last few years with the Republicans basically saying no for the last 4 years, or last 2 years during Barack Obama's term. No to everything on purpose, and now they're about to get the House of Representatives back. Yeah. Looking back on what happened during the Blair years here, what's the difference, what the Tories could do when Tony Blair was in charge versus what the Republicans can do in the United States when they weren't in charge?
Well, I think what happened in our time, we inherited, we left for the Labour government a pretty prosperous economy. And they held the line for a bit, and then things went radically wrong with spending. We criticised them pretty roundly at the time and saying, here you are, you're not mending the roof when the sun is shining, and when it rains, we'll all get wet. And that's what's happened. So it's much more difficult now, starting from a difficult position, to get back in the economy. Now, I don't know if I'm fair about this because I don't follow American politics that closely, but there is one thing which I have noticed about politicians, and that is that if they're going to lose in the vote because they haven't got a majority, they can say some pretty outrageous things in terms of criticising their opponents, knowing that their opponents are going to get the thing through anyway, and they want to be on the safe ground of criticising so that they can be ready in years to come to say, oh, well, that didn't work, this didn't work, and that didn't work. And I suspect if they had been the other way around, the other parties the other way around, the other parties would have each said similar things than they're saying. In other words, when you're in government, you are faced with some pretty horrendous problems, and there's no way ducking them. You've got to try and deal with them. When you're in opposition, you can pick and choose that which you'll make a fuss about and that which you'll let get by. And no doubt, from where I sat, that some of the major industries in the United States, particularly I think of the car industries and others, had built up over the years some very, very deep-seated problems which had to be resolved. I had it a little bit in the coal mining industry in this country, where, if I remember rightly, we had 9 pensioners of the coal industry for every 1 employee in the company. And no company can survive that sort of historical on-cost, and big decisions have to be taken. But oppositions sometimes criticise a bit, knowing perfectly well they might have to do some of the things themselves if they found themselves in government.
As a taxpayer, where do you start with that? I mean, we hear about this thing called VAT, and we don't have it. We have a sales tax.
It's the same thing, basically.
Except the sales tax, in most cases, doesn't go above 10%.
Yeah.
Once in a great while, it does in some states. But there's no national sales tax. Explain the VAT.
Well, we, of course, don't have a states system in the way that you do, and so we don't really have smaller units of government within the overall state that are capable of organising their own budgets and their own tax-raising system. And they raise charges of various kinds, but almost all the expenditure is raised by the state, by the central state. and spent by the central state. And value-added tax is really, it's just a mega sales tax. It's a slightly more complicated system. It is value-added so that each individual along the chain from the production of an item to the final sale of an item pays tax on the proportion of value that has been added while it's been in their hands. But from the point of view of the ordinary citizen, all you know is that prices, when quoted, you add 17.5% to them, although most retailers would add that automatically. And now that's going up to 20% very soon indeed.
So 20% of everything you buy basically is going to have,
everything except
every buy is going to have a 20% tax on it.
Everything except food, children's clothing, newspapers, magazines, charities. There are a few exempted items, but about 90% of what we buy.
The VAT is going to go up at the start of the year, and that was the thing that was different. It was the one new tax rise that this administration announced, although they offset it by cutting. There was a payroll tax rise that they're not going to completely implement, but instead they're doing this VAT rise, this consumption tax rise. The Conservatives in the 80s, Margaret Thatcher famously, increased VAT very sharply in the middle of a recession in the early 80s, and for some generations that still has resonance. So people will be focused on that. The price of the things they buy could well go up as a result of that. We should remember that's a 20%. Most people in the US don't think in those terms in terms of a sale tax. This is a sale tax on everything except food, which is going to be 20% on top of the regular retail price. So people will notice that.
Do you have a property tax that you pay?
Not really. We pay a tax on transfers of property. So whenever you transfer a property, you pay a proportion of that. That's in the lower percentages as a tax. We also we have what are called domestic rates. Well, it's now called the council tax. Used to be called domestic rates. This is for your local authority, your town hall or whatever, and you pay a tax according to the value, very approximately according to the value of your property. But all these taxes are very small beer compared with VAT and income tax, which are the big ones.
Well, go to the council tax. What percentage of your income would you pay, or what percentage of your property value would you pay a year?
Well, let me see. I think I pay about £1,500 a year. I have a high valued property, about
That's something like $2,500.
That's about $2,500 on a property that is worth perhaps $2 million, something like that. So it's not enormous.
In the United States, you'd pay anywhere from, I don't know, $15,000 and above for something like that, at least.
Yeah.
So what other kinds of tax do you have, and how much of this is going to go up besides your VAT tax?
Well, the other really big ones are excise taxes, and that is primarily on tobacco, alcohol, and fuel. We pay a huge amount of tax on fuel. I think more than half the cost of a gallon or a litre of fuel is now the tax.
No, but a litre is, what is there, 3 or 4 liters to a gallon?
Yes, yeah.
And how much is a litre of gas here?
It's more than £2, more than nearly $4, I would say, a litre, something like that.
Just for a litre. I mean, our gas will, I think the last thing I saw was about $3 a gallon.
Yes, yeah.
So yours is 3 to 4 times more expensive.
Yeah. The government raises a huge amount of revenue on fuel taxes. It raises a huge amount of revenue also on alcohol taxes, where the greater part of a cost of a bottle of wine is the excise duty. Now that is causing, and tobacco too, those two last are causing difficulties for the government, because on the other side of the English Channel in the European Union, they don't pay anything like that amount of tax on alcohol or tobacco, as a result of which, because we're all in a customs union together, people are just getting onto the ferries, crossing the channel with trucks and coming back loaded with beer and cigarettes. And so the Exchequer is being deprived of quite a lot of revenue. So there's a sort of automatic balancing, levelling, equalising of taxation going on across the European Union, caused for simply by the fact that if one country charges a hell of a lot more tax for anything than another, people will go to the other country to get it.
What else is different about politics in this country versus the United States?
We don't have a religious right, and issues like abortion are not party political. we have access to abortion in this country, and people, you sometimes get debate about the time limit. I mean, because you can't have an abortion in this country easily if the child is a certain, if the child in the womb is too far advanced. But nobody disputes a woman's right to choose, and it's not a party political matter. You don't have a religious right promoting it. You know, there is no idea in this country of a right to bear arms. This whole thing about gun control is not an issue in this country because actually it's very unusual outside of the countryside where people need guns to shoot birds or whatever. Very unusual for people to have guns in their homes. There is no right to bear arms. We have some of the strictest gun control laws in the world. I mean, the number of people killed by guns in London in a year is probably less than are killed by guns in New York in a month, I would have thought. So, abortion, the right to bear arms, the whole issue of civil partnerships and gay marriage. I mean, we've had civil partnerships, which is just a form of gay marriage in this country, for years and years. These are not subjects in dispute. All of these, I suppose, lifestyle, sort of ethics issues are not politicised in this country.
Why not?
Because the British don't think it's right. The British think these are matters of conscience. And when abortion, for instance, came up before the British Parliament, people were allowed to vote with their conscience. And there were members of Parliament who were Catholics who voted against abortion. But the majority of MPs are in favour of it. Just as with the death penalty. We don't have the death penalty. We haven't had it for years and years because the British don't think it's right or humane.
You have been for years openly gay and a member of the conservative wing of politics in this country. If you're in the United States, that might not be easy. Why have you been so open about it?
It might not be easy. On the other hand, you could find a range of people on the right in America to basically to give exactly the same story as I'm giving, which is that to believe in homosexual law reform, to believe that gay people are equal citizens, and to believe that relationships between people of the same sex are not necessarily antisocial, dangerous, or personally damaging, is not inconsistent with being a conservative, with being a fiscal conservative, with believing in a small state, indeed with believing that the state shouldn't trample over too much over people's private lives, and believing in individual freedom of conscience, freedom of speech. These are all things that a conservative ought to be able to support. I mean, I know Andrew Sullivan is only an honorary American, but talk to Andrew Sullivan in the United States and you'll get the same story from him as you will from me and millions of other conservatives.
Explain your philosophy of having a partner and 2 children. Is that accepted universally here in Great Britain?
Well, we now have a leader of the opposition who has a partner and 2 children. He's just had a second child, Ed Miliband. And I think it's pretty common. I may be wrong, but I think last year was the first time where more than half of the children born in the UK were born out of wedlock, as we would say. So it is certainly a very common thing. I suspect I will get married. It was just one of those things that we were sort of, in the modern world, you end up spending more time looking for a house and starting a family, and then you look around and say, oh, we're not married yet, we'll have to fix that sometime in the future.
In the United States, it's about 30% are born out of wedlock, and in some groups, it's as high as 70%. Mm-hmm. What's your philosophy of not marrying? Where'd that come from?
As I say, I think it wasn't a conscious decision. I think if you meet someone sort of later in life, I mean, we met in our late 30s, and so you end up feeling there's a little bit more of a time pressure. I've never been one of those people who dreamed about what my wedding would look like. I wasn't really ever sure I would get married, and it seemed like a bigger priority to, as I say, find somewhere to live together and to start a family than to get married. Also, the family started a bit quicker than we thought it might take, so in that sense it was just a question of timing.
How old are your kids?
2 and 4.
One of the things that you see when you walk around the Houses of Parliament is very tight security. When you ride the subways here, it doesn't look any more secure than any of our subways. As a matter of fact, you don't hardly see a policeman anywhere. Mm-hmm. You had that tragic subway accident where terrorists blew it up and killed, 150 people or something like that? What has that done to this society? Of course, I know you had the IRA and the bombs over the years.
You see, Britain takes a slightly different view of terrorist violence than the Americans. It's partly because we went through the Second World War and we were bombed. And then, of course, you had the IRA in the 70s and 80s. So, I mean, I live in London and I take the subway. And the day after we had the terrorist attacks on the subway, I was back on the subway. And so was everybody else. We kind of looked at each other. But it's like there's this mutual feeling. We're not going to let terrorists stop us, do you know what I mean? Using our subway and going to work. British people are a little bit more phlegmatic about terrorist violence than the Americans. It's that, what they call stiff upper lip. We just get on with it.
You know, a lot of our audience may not remember our previous interviews a long time ago, but I want to run a little clip of the one we did in 1988 because it tells a little bit of a story that they should know about you before we go any farther.
An IRA bomb went off, which was designed to blow up the British government, I was unfortunately in a bedroom which was very near to the bomb. My wife was killed instantly. There were 4 other people killed and a lot of people wounded. And I was really very badly wounded and was 7 hours under the rubble before they managed to dig me out. I don't think anybody else was under for more than about 3 hours, but they got me out alive, just about. And I had a long time in hospital. And then I had to set to and rebuild my life.
Go back to when that happened, please.
Yeah. Well, I was fortunate enough. I got married again fairly soon afterwards, who was a great friend of my first wife's. And I have not one more son, so we've got 3 sons. And we have just celebrated our silver wedding, my second wife and I. So it's 25 years ago since that happened. And so I have rebuilt my life in that sense, and I have a wonderful family around me, which helped. I still have trouble with my legs where they were crushed. I was in hospital, in fact, only just a few days ago, where every now and again I get a flare-up of difficulties with my legs, but they can sort it out. I mean, I don't like to have to go, but they can sort it out. So that side of it hasn't completely cured, but the human spirit does recover, and I was lucky.
What year was this?
This would have been 1984. So it was just over 25 years ago when the bomb occurred.
And that's the IRA, the Irish Republican Army.
Correct, yes. And of course a lot's happened in the political scene as well, so far as they're concerned, and we are trying to work together with them in Northern Ireland and with some success too.
Are you surprised that there's no more of the bombings going on?
Well, there are still a small element who I think would like to try and get the bombings going again, but they've not got much popular support, even with the elements in Irish society that would have been in favour of basically united Ireland. So I think so far things are reasonably under control. But you know, it's been a lot of hard work gradually getting things going again.
That was a party event, the Conservative Party meeting?
It was the annual convention, basically, yes.
How many people were killed?
5 people were killed in the hotel I was in, and there was only a bomb. Because I was the government chief whip at the time, I was in the next room to Mrs. Thatcher. Of course, it was Mrs. Thatcher, no doubt they were after, but the bomb went off in the room above, and I fell 4 stories in the hotel, and so they dug me out 7 hours later from the foyer of the hotel, and the only reason I survived was really luck. A girder from the hotel came down and stopped the hotel crushing me, stopped the rubble crushing me, and the springs of a bed gave me enough air to keep me going. But it was a pretty horrendous thing.
Is there any lesson for Americans looking at 9/11, thinking that this will never be over?
Well, I think you've got to have a combination of strong security. You've got to do what is best to try and frustrate them. You need very good intelligence, and some very brave men have usually infiltrated some of these organizations to find out what is going on. But at the same time, I think political leaders have got to be able to start some sort of dialogue with these people, because however evil the overall organization might be, there are some less evil people in it, and some people that could be persuaded that a peaceful path is what's required, and what you mustn't do is to drive them all into the hard line. And so in all of these successful things, I think there have been some negotiations where the moderate people are gradually drawn away from the real hardliners, and you can make some progress.
Why did you run for the House of Commons in the first place?
Why did I run? I wanted to speak up for people who didn't have a voice. I mean, I became an MP 23 years ago. There were very few women. Out of 650, there were about 20 Labour women. And there were no black people at all. And I was the first black woman elected to Parliament. And I was dazed but proud, because it was an opportunity to speak up for people who wouldn't have got heard otherwise.
First black woman to be in the Parliament of this country.
Yes, and I was elected, I think, 150 years after the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. So it shows you there's such a thing as progress. Well, there's a great many more minority members now, on both sides of the aisle. The Conservative Party, who are now the ruling party, have done very well, actually. And there were about half a dozen black minority members when they didn't have any when I first came in. And on my side, we've got many more minority members. So there has been an advance. Not as many as I think there should be, but it's a big advance from when I first started.
Well, given the system, and you obviously are aware of what goes on in the United States, we have over 40 members of the U.S. House of Representatives out of 435. What's the total number? I think I read it's 3% of 646 members.
I think it's about, I think that it's about 20 something now.
So under your system, how do you get more minorities elected?
Well, what the Conservative Party did is they put a lot of pressure on their local organisations to elect minority members. What we don't have here is what we have in the United States, which are districts which are almost entirely minority and will, under most circumstances, elect a minority member. We don't have that sort of district here because we don't have the kind of history of segregation and so on. So it's in the Labour Party, progressives wanted to see more minorities. And then in the Conservative Party, I think they began to feel in the 21st century they should look more diverse. And so they encouraged, that's probably the politest thing, they encouraged local associations to select minorities. There's some very good people coming through on the Conservative side.
What part of your life here is regulated? In other words, do you have a lot of regulatory agencies that regulate the media, regulate energy, all the different aspects of life? Part of Whitehall, the government?
Well, I don't think it's, I don't think it's particularly regulated. For instance, in the media, you couldn't have a station like Fox in this country.
You could not, or you could?
You could. You couldn't have a station like Fox.
Mr. Murdoch owns Sky.
Yeah, but it's a very different station from Fox, because all of the terrestrial and satellite television stations have a responsibility in their news to be balanced.
Do you feel that the news is balanced here?
Yeah, I think it is. When you compare it to Fox and MSNBC, different ends of the spectrum, it's a lot more balanced.
See, Americans would say that this is freedom. Freedom to say whatever you want to say, freedom to have a gun in your house if you want to have it. All the things that we've been talking about here, they would. The First Amendment protects speech. In other words, you would be able to spend. A lot of people argue you ought to be able to spend whatever you want to on politicians and politics.
But it's a freedom at the expense of those who don't have money. It's a freedom at the expense of the poor. It's a freedom at the expense of the people at the bottom of the pile. And it's a freedom sometimes to spread untruths. It's extraordinary. How many Americans believe that Barack Obama is a Muslim? It's a freedom to continually repeat things which are wholly misleading. That, in the end, doesn't produce a stable society. If people are accustomed to hearing things without contradiction,
Is there a difference in journalism in the two countries?
I think there's certainly, and I noticed it on the New York Times, having worked at the Financial Times, which is a very serious newspaper here, but there is, if you like, a little bit, you could say they trust their journalists more, or you could say that they have much lower standards in terms of fact-checking and everything else. But they do, they basically leave the journalist to make their own judgments on many things in
Where,
a way.
over in the States?
No, in the UK.
Oh, in the UK.
Here. And that may, certainly other newspapers, not necessarily the FT, but at many newspapers that means that there's less, there's just a lot of stories that aren't true. I mean, the Sunday newspapers, someone once said to me, the great thing about the Sundays is that stories don't have to be as true, which I thought was a rather worrying expression, but that's the kind of way that people sometimes talk in the UK. Of course, you'd never hear that in any serious newspaper in the US, and I found I was taken aback initially and then rather impressed by the amount of attention to detail when I was working at the New York Times and the fact-checking.
You ran something, I don't know the full title, Press Complaints Board?
Yes, yes, Press Complaints Commission.
Commission.
Yes.
What is it? Who runs it? And who controls it?
Yeah. What it was it was to put it absolutely bluntly, it was an attempt by the newspaper industry to demonstrate that they had set up a body to seek to raise press standards, particularly standards of invasion of privacy and inaccurate reporting and things, partly to stop either political party, whoever won the election, to bring in any control, statutory control of the press. And they wanted me to run it after the first chap, who was a very nice man, but hadn't really made much of an impact. And he retired, and they wanted me there. And my task was, one, to force up the standards, if I could, by getting the public to complain about anything they thought was unfair, wrong, inaccurate, distorted, invasion of privacy, things of that sort. But we had no actual legal penalties. We couldn't fine people, but what we could do is criticize them pretty heavily. And the newspapers hated that. They hated that completely. But of course, it was also free to make a complaint to. We never got charged anything for making a complaint. Lawyers weren't involved. And we did, I think, raise the standards over the years.
Who paid for it?
The newspaper industry paid for it. And I was the one who was the chairman, had to maintain our independence from the newspapers. I mean, I had to be sufficiently respected by people to say that I wasn't their tool, because we were being paid for by the newspaper and made no secret of it.
What years did you run it?
I ran it for 7 years. I guess I started in about 1995 and I went to about 1981, 82.
You took on somebody publicly in that time period that the Americans are about to meet, a guy named Piers Morgan.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, he's going to take the Larry King show. What was his
well,
problem?
I will tell you exactly. And I mean, I'm very fond of him. He's a very successful man, and he'll be very successful in America. And I've got no hard feelings about it at all. But it was when I was first starting, and he published photographs of, I think it was the first Earl Spencer's wife, who was walking in the grounds of a nursing home where she'd gone to for a mental breakdown.
And who is Earl Spencer?
He's one of our big, he's the brother of Princess Diana. And he's one of our big landowners and big aristocrats of the old school. I mean, I'm an aristocrat of the new school. Don't have any land or vestige, but he's one of the big ones. And this was right at the heart of what we were trying to stop. That is the intrusion of somebody in hospital. And I said that this was a very serious breach of the code. And it was right at the beginning of the time. So I went to Rupert Murdoch and I said, look, in the end, it's you has to have people that you have confidence in running your show.
He ran News of the World then?
News of the World, a popular newspaper. And Rupert Murdoch said, very famously, the conduct of this young man is unacceptable. And he shortly afterwards left. Of course, he went and got a better job with another newspaper. I don't think he did himself any harm doing it. And I invited him to lunch, and we had lunch together, and we're good friends. There's no hard feelings about it at all. It was part of a process of trying to demonstrate that a free newspaper system did not require government intervention and laws to stop it intruding into people's privacy.
What are we more alike than different on?
I think we're alike just historically, the British and Americans have a lot in common. I mean, the big difference, obviously, is you have a written constitution, and that written constitution means that you have a Supreme Court and a President and a House of Representatives, and they all balance each other. I think our common history brings us together. I think that, having fought, to be honest, in the Iraq War and certainly in the Second World War, side by side, has brought us together. I think that there's a lot that Britain and America have in common. There are aspects of the American system which are highly admirable. I think the way Obama could sweep through the American system and become president was really admirable. It couldn't really happen in this country. I think in some ways, American society is a more open society than British society, and it's much less class-ridden than British society. I think that's a good thing.
For a DVD copy of this program, call 1-877-662-7726. For free transcripts or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at qna.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.